Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the United States, where 15 Democratic senators have written a letter, to the Facebook CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, about the platform and its need to do more to mitigate anti-Muslim bigotry and the spread of it on the platform. Now, we know that the platform is being used a lot, and social media overall is used a lot for hateful rhetoric, unfortunately, in today's world. And this affects not only Muslim populations, but of course Muslims as well around the world, in places especially like Myanmar, the Rohingya Muslims, as well as in significantly other places also where we have, because of terror attacks, we've had this growing far-right movement also against Muslims online, just in part, of course, but it's a much more multifaceted issue than just as I'm putting it right now. Facebook, according to these senators, has not enforced properly its quote-unquote call to arms policy, which it had said it would enforce a number of years ago, saying that, it needs to go through this, it needs to control hate speech online. How much of this can be done in a reasonable fashion then without, of course, infringing anybody's right to free speech as well? Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Sahar Khamis, who is the professor of communication, at the University of Maryland. She's joining us this morning from Washington, D.C. Joining us from Orlando, Florida, is Jonathan Matusitz. He is an associate professor of terrorism studies at the University of Central Florida. Jonathan and Sahar, good morning to you both, and thank you for joining us here in Scope. Jonathan, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of Facebook's role, right, in just the spread of hate speech? I mean, we can talk, of course, about social media in general, Twitter included, about that sort of thing.
Facebook has had that rule for 1 year, and it doesn't surprise me that an institution has rules or laws but does not apply them. There is a federal law in the U.S. called sedition. See, sedition is any speech or conduct that incites people to rebel against the government, but sedition rules are rarely applied. In the case of Facebook, there are hate speech laws and laws against incitement to violence, but they're rarely applied. So I understand the frustration of those 15 senators, and it was reflected in their letter.
So then, what needs to be done, then, Jonathan? I mean, I wonder that from Facebook's point of view, I would think that they would argue, listen, this is like a tidal wave, right? And it's hitting us, and we're essentially having a hard time controlling it, I would imagine, would be one of the arguments. I mean, how would you respond to that? Should
we not define hate speech first? What do they mean by hate speech? Is any discussion on a controversial subject hate speech? Because there are subjects like Islam, immigration, abortion. So every time you discuss these subjects, you're straddling the fence between offending someone or not offending someone. And in order to make a valid argument on any controversial subject, you should risk offending someone, especially if you have no malicious intent. So what's missing in our discussion is a definition of hate speech. Now, we all agree that there should be no incitement to violence against any group.
Yeah.
I remember it was a general in Myanmar, because you mentioned Myanmar, and he was urging ethnic cleansing against Muslims in Myanmar. That's more than hate speech.
Yeah.
It's incitement to violence. So that should be outright condemned. That should be banned. That's prosecutable. But now, what is hate speech? Who's to define hate speech? So that's really missing in our discussion.
That's a very good point. Sahar, what are your thoughts about how we should define hate speech then?
Thank you so much for having me again on the show. It's always a pleasure to participate with you in Scope. Thank you, Waqar. I think that this is a very slippery slope because, yes, I do understand Jonathan's point about, freedom of speech, and people have the right to express their views and their opinions, and they should not be somehow, penalized for doing so. But indeed, whenever you get into the area of being offensive to other people's deep beliefs, like what we have seen, for example, recently in France, and there has been this whole discussion about, targeting a certain group like like Muslims and, profiling them, or, in the case of, cartoons and offensive drawings of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings of God be upon him. All of that is a very slippery slope because it does create this very tense and very uncomfortable and very dangerous environment, which can somehow lead to incitement of violence. So there is a very thin line that really divides all of these things. It's a very blurry boundary, and it's a very dangerous and slippery slope as well, because it may not necessarily call for, destroying a certain mosque or specifically taking action against Muslims per se, but it can really lead to all of this kind of friction and all of this kind of violence and all of this incitement against a certain group, which is in this particular case Muslims. So there's need really to become much more specific and a need to become much more clear about all of these definitions. And when does it really stop as free speech and become blasphemy or become incitement or become hate speech? That is a very important controversy. Up till this very moment, I'm afraid it has not been completely or totally resolved.
Sahar, if I'm going to play devil's advocate for a moment, but the argument sometimes is that Muslims, or I'm generalizing, of course, are too sensitive, and that they're not open to open discussions about Islam online. How do you respond to that?
I think that, there is this very bitter joke that, some Muslims actually sometimes use. They say, that if there is, hate speech against Jews, it's called anti-Semitism. If it's against women, it's called sexism. If it's against blacks, it's called racism. If it's against, immigrants, it's xenophobia. But if it's against Muslims, it's considered free speech. So basically, Muslims feel like they've been a target of a lot of Islamophobic sentiment and a lot of hate speech and a lot of incitement of violence and a lot of profiling in a very negative and very destructive way. And sometimes it's really very discriminatory and in many cases even dangerous and can really cost them their own lives or their property or their loved ones. And we have seen examples of that in the surge of Islamophobia in many different parts of the world. The United States is no exception, under the Trump administration. There has been a surge in cases of hate speech online, as well as actual acts of incitement and violence, in real life situations. We have seen, attacks on mosques and Islamic centers, and women like myself who are wearing the hijab become easy targets because
Right.
they're very visible. They can become easy targets of hate and actual violence, whether physical or verbal or both. So we are talking about a very serious issue here, and we all have to step up and really take our responsibility very seriously.
Okay, so I don't want to get bogged down in the details too much, but I know that we can all agree that certainly we do not want hateful content online, and especially as you had correctly pointed out in your earlier answer, that that in any way calls for violence against any group of people, right? So in this specific case, we're talking about Muslims, but that, of course, undoubtedly we would all agree it stretches to everybody, regardless of your faith group, ethnicity, etc. Now, how does one go about though controlling that sort of thing, right? What needs to happen? Facebook. And Twitter, and we can probably a long list, even Instagram, I would imagine, is dealing with the exact same thing, as are others, WhatsApp, etc. How does one go about dealing with that? Because it also seems that there's sometimes a question of terminology, right? So when we had the Christchurch attacks, though the government of New Zealand immediately called it terror attacks, even till today, there's many who were not labeled at that. I mean, I know it's a very small detail in some people's eyes, but those sorts of things create a narrative, don't they?
Well, it's not a small detail. Terrorism is terrorism. And in the case of the shooting in New Zealand, what he did was he was broadcasting a 17-minute video of his shootings. So that should be banned right away. And it took a long time for Facebook to ban it. I mean, Facebook should have banned it right away. Now, my question was define hate speech. So I have a question for Dr. Khamis, define Islamophobia. I know that a lot of social media platforms and institutions do have rules and laws against hate speech and incitement to violence, and they don't apply these laws very often. But if these laws have to be applied, they have to be applied for everybody. And we start with a definition. This is what hate speech looks like. This is what incitement to violence looks like. In the United States, people have the right to protest. We have the First Amendment. We have freedom of speech. And unfortunately, to some people, even hate speech is a form of free speech. So where is the boundary? Where does it stop?
Yeah. Right, Sahar, I'm sorry, Jonathan. I don't mean to cut you off. I just have a minute left. Unfortunately, the clock is getting the best of us very quickly. Sahar, just under a minute, if you can. How does one deal with this in a logical fashion, right? Because you're also a professor of communication, so certainly we don't want conversations to end, because it's in fact, as you well know, and I'm sure Jonathan well knows, it's actually through communication that hate is lessened. How does one deal with that then online?
I mean, there is also a very big, important issue here, which is really the role of all of these social media platforms, right? We want them to step up to become better gatekeepers, meaning they have to really take a responsibility to filter a lot of the destructive and offensive content that can lead to the incitement of violence, which is the slippery slope I talked about before, or the thin line I mentioned before. You know, social media started as quote unquote social media, as the name implies, right? They're supposed to be a place for you to network with friends and, you know, invite them to your birthday party and your wedding, but then they evolved into something much bigger than that. They became actually important platforms for getting information. And oftentimes, as we are seeing now in the midst of our, elections crisis here in the United States, there is this whole notion of misinformation and disinformation. People who believe that the election has been, fraudulent, or there has been some kind of fraud, although there are no, basis for any of these baseless claims. But there is always this notion of conspiracy theory, misinformation, disinformation, and yes, offensive speech and hate speech. All of that can spread and can go viral over social media, including Facebook and Twitter, and they have to step up to take their own responsibility very seriously as gatekeepers. Up till this moment in time, unfortunately, we have not seen that happen, and we still have a long way to go before we come to a regulatory space that can really kind of put certain guidelines in place to make sure that they're doing their job efficiently, effectively, and with less harm for the public good.
Very well. Well, we do sincerely appreciate both Sahar and Jonathan for their time and, of course, their expert insight. We've just shown you that, there are within this topic of hate speech also disagreements that need to be spoken of. It's important to have these conversations. It's important to have definitions, as Jonathan there said, for what is hate speech, what is Islamophobia. Yes, all of that should be defined out. At the same time, of course, there needs to be an agreement that, yes, calls to violence of any sort, even, implications towards violence, need to be controlled and need to be policed and ended and censored, or whatever the word may be. Because, yes, as Sahar also then said, these social media companies need to be the gatekeepers because they're the ones providing the platform for these people to be able to then spread their sort of hatred, prejudice, and bias, which then results in very real world consequences, such as Christchurch and, a whole host of other such events that have taken place as well, terror attacks that have taken place. Again, like I said, important discussions to be having, and we need to then discuss all the issues, debate out the issues, and talk about where the limits end and where the limits should be made more free vis-a-vis free speech versus hate speech. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment of today's show, we're going to discuss the UK, where children under the age of 10 even are being investigated currently for links to far-right extremism. The Home Office figures that have been released show a dramatic rise, in fact, in the number of under 18s that are being referred to the government's counter-terror program called Channel over concerns about possible involvement with the far-right. Now, child-specific content by the far-right include things like memes, video games, etc. How much of a concern should this be? Because, to be completely fair, even within the PREVENT program, there was a concern about how children were being swept up within that, within Muslim communities especially. Is it right to be going after under 10s as well at this point in time for such forms of extremism? Can an under 10-year-old even be held to account for that sort of thing? How does one deal with that in a reasonable fashion? Let's discuss that further with our guest who is joining us. We're now joined by Dr. William Allchorn, who is an associate director at the Center for the Analysis of the Radical Right. He's joining us today from Leeds in the UK. William, thanks very much for your time today. What do you make of the fact that these children are being investigated over links to far-right extremism? As I said in my intro, isn't this the very exact same thing which PREVENT was criticized for doing with for example, Muslim children?
Thanks, Waqar. I think, these recent figures are fairly concerning. We're seeing a lot of, especially on the neo-Nazi end of the far-right spectrum in the UK, of groups targeting younger people. either through, as you suggested, memes or through games online. The online space is a key enabler of that. And also, if we look at stepping away from referrals to the government counter-radicalisation programme, we also see referrals to non-governmental organisations like Exit UK. I think that statistic of a 9-year-old came from their founder, Nigel Bromwich, who's also an ex-neo-Nazi. So if we're looking at this picture, we also have to factor in cases that we've also seen. And again, a large number in recent years, when we see reporting on cases involving preparation or planning for terrorism on the far right, has been, we've seen that younger profile coming in as well. And some of the enabling factors is that online space, but also some of the groups within the UK more tacitly targeting younger people.
How does this then in a reasonable fashion, right? Because going back to Prevent, I'm making this comparison because, again, within Prevent, as you know, many Muslim parents were concerned about how the fact that every little thing that their child was doing was being, surveyed in some way as if to mean that they were guilty already. Do you think that the lessons have been learned so that doesn't then happen with these children? I mean, how does one reasonably then prevent these children from becoming radicalized by these far-right groups, et cetera, without then at the same time also holding them to account in the fashion you would hold an adult to account?
That's a really good question, Waqar. And I think it's really good to learn those lessons. And I think especially when we're looking at the far right, there's often a frame added to it, which is slightly different from Islamist extremism in relation to this idea of mental health being a key factor and perhaps some sort of personality disorder. But if we have a look at the majority of cases that come to trial, a large number of these do have those factors involved, but we also see people away from that kind of risk factor. And I think in terms of that question of kind of being careful not to stigmatize people, I think that's a really valuable and interesting lesson going forward, especially as we're seeing parity in referrals from both Islamist extremist and far-right backgrounds, especially around not stigmatizing certain communities, particularly white working class communities, because that could actually add a grievance factor that could be preyed upon by groups and also become a grievance factor for individuals.
Yeah. And how much do you think, William, the political realities on the ground in the UK play a part in this, right? So firstly, we have a prime minister right now in 10 Downing Street who has said some fairly colorful things, if I may use that term, which would be seen as racist and or really just at the edge of just being racist. And then we, of course, have had the Brexit referendum not too long ago, and then the entire Brexit process and, the divorce from the EU. Do you think all of those realities also play into then the reality on the ground that the far right is growing stronger?
Yes, I think that broader climate, the coarsening of public discourse, through research that I've seen, has seen an uptick, especially we're looking at hate crimes. We saw a noticeable uptick because of kind of the inflammation of negative rhetoric around immigration, around the EU referendum. And we also see kind of those upticks happening at other trigger events. So we had a series of terror attacks in 2017. But also added to that, we have to, as you rightly kind of point out, we have to factor in responsible discourse by elite politicians. And unfortunately, Boris Johnson has kind of fallen foul of that in some occasions, and that's led to increased reporting in hate crimes. So I think politicians need to be very careful in what they say and try to not give a license of hatred to both people who are non-aligned to the far right, but also far right actors to them kind of see that as a recommendation of their cause, as it were.
And just as a comment before I let you go then, William, on the issue then of education, right? I mean, logically, for children that young, even whichever side of extremism they fall on, education is vital, certainly?
Yeah, I think definitely education about these groups and what they stand for and some of the risks of becoming involved and what that means for your life chances more broadly, but also a wider education in terms of critical digital literacy. So knowing how different platforms perhaps push people down rabbit holes of radicalization, and also teaching young people how to kind of critically evaluate content online, so that they know that they need to look out for where it's coming from, and who are some of the more dangerous kind of messengers to look out for.
I want to leave it there at that, William, but we do sincerely appreciate your sharing your expertise with us here in Scope. That was William Allchorn speaking to us there from Leeds in the UK about this report that's come out from the Home Office about how now even under 10, children under the age of 10 are being investigated for links to far-right extremism, them being essentially entrapped through video games, memes, videos overall online. All of this, again, occurring in the virtual space, and that is increasingly becoming the battlefield to try to control all these forms of extremism online. Is the government doing enough? Are governments around the world, be it in the Western countries or otherwise, doing enough to control such forms of extremism? That's, of course, an open debate. How does one even go about doing that? Have the lessons been learned in how they've dealt with other forms of quote-unquote extremism, or have supposedly tried to deal with other forms of extremism as well? Because those, for a large part, have been major failures, i.e. the PREVENT program or otherwise. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in the Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment, we're going to discuss France. Lawmakers are debating a bill banning the publication of images of police, images including video images as well, by the way. This is, of course, going to then to the heart of the argument of police brutality in France. We know that in banlieues or in suburbs of Paris and in other such areas, there have been for a very long time concerns about police brutality in those areas. And there have been, in fact, protests about this very issue where journalists, again, have been jailed. So what does this then mean for press freedoms in the country? Now, on top of that, there's another issue about France's education minister speaking about universities and using the term Islamo-leftism, saying that that is doing damage inside French universities by having this politically correct language at all points in time whenever discussions about anything come up. Is that a fair criticism of French universities and academia? Because then there is now a concern about academic freedom as well. An open letter has been written by many who are saying that they're being, mislabeled or unfairly labeled as Islamo-leftists, whatever that means, that macro, wide-ranging word may mean. And of course, this is all in the context of, wide-ranging criticism of how President Emmanuel Macron and entire French society really in many ways is moving, not just in a racist necessarily fashion, but in a very Islamophobic fashion as well at this point in time. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. I'm joined by Hamid, who is a political commentator, columnist, and journalist who is joining us today from Paris. Joining us today from Ankara is Abdennour Toumi, who is a researcher in the North Africa Department of Oursam Center, which is the Middle East Center for Studies. Abdennour and Hamid, thank you both for joining us here in Scope. Abdennour, let me start with you, and let's firstly start with this issue of the banning of images of police officers. I know that's still just being debated at this point, but there have already been protests about that in France, and they're being suppressed quite strongly by police themselves. What do you make of that entire issue?
Thank you for having me on your show, and hello to your guests as well and your viewers. Actually, as you may know, politics is full of irony and surprises. But what keeps surprise the public opinion, actually here in France and abroad, is the latest bold decisions of President Macron and his interior minister. So actually it doesn't go that far, because it feels like they are trying to remind us what happened with the Bush administration in the post 9/11 attack, and immediately they started to legislate and threat the freedom of the American people and elite, and actually, ironically, the liberals in the U.S. So to sum up all this, it looks like Macron is applying kind of a U.S. Patriot Act or copying from that playbook. However, he will face a serious resistance on this stance because, I mean, it doesn't matter how he and the far right and even the so-called conventional right, media elite and political parties pushing for this, but they will have a serious resistance from the other camp.
You know, Hamid, it's interesting, right? Because these issues now don't just affect Muslims in France, right? They're starting to affect everybody. Do you think Macron and his ministers are going too far when it comes to this issue of police and even when it comes to the issue of universities?
Thank you so much for having me. Let's be clear. This is the opinion public is shaken by these measures, particularly this Articles 24 for the law, and when it banned the journalists to show the police brutality in the streets. And of course, this is targeting the freedom of journalists, the freedom of speech, and the dignity of the journalists. And this, of course, will have a big resistance to the French society and the civil society. Obviously, the President Macron is a failing in his government, and he doesn't have any answer for the social and economic problem, and he's trying to diverse to the another topics. But he will have, of course, a very huge resistance to his attacks against the freedom of speech. Yesterday, the Commissioner of United Nations in Geneva of the Human Rights sent a letter to the President Macron, saying to him that he has to respect the freedom of speech of the law. And with these documents, this document has written by 3 commissioners with 7 pages that is urging to Emmanuel Macron to respect the freedom of speech in France. And that is, I think, it's a big issue now for the French president, and he has been isolated with himself.
You know, where there's also then the issue of the education minister, right, talking about Islamo-leftism within French universities. Academia, I think, has been under the spotlight for a while now, right, in France, and there's been an aim to control conversations about Islam and, you know, not just Muslims, of course, but I'm saying just in general, also conversations about the Republic. How worrying is that? Because, you know, if we don't have open conversations in places like universities, where else can we have them?
That's a good point, because actually that's where the student and the new generation will learn critical thinking. And French has the history, and in French universities and academia milieux, they have this liberal thoughts and critics toward the establishments and the politicians. And we don't go that far, actually, just in the pre-May 68, and that led to the fall of General de Gaulle. So again, it's still as your guest have pointed out, that President Macron is right now, and his administration are in the panic mode. So they don't know how to answer to the socioeconomic demands that the French people are worried about, and was the origin of the spark of the yellow vest 2 years ago, and also go with the pandemic crisis, which has entered it, which is in second wave, and they are actually panicking. So and actually, very interesting. I mean, these 2 figures, main figures in Macron's administration and in the Castex government, so his interior minister and education minister, became the face of his administration. Therefore, this government is taking the right or going to the right voters. So, and again, an answer to the Marine Le Pen's voters and the so-called Sarkozyist sympathizers. So it's a very, very interesting dynamic here, because President Macron right now, he's not looking for the immediate solution. He's looking for his re-election in 2022.
Exactly.
Whereas knew that he has a serious challengers, and with not only Marine Le Pen, because Marine Le Pen is in his pocket, because he knew he can defeat it in second round. But his main challenger will be the General de Villiers, actually, who was his military chief of staff, who fired him in 2017. So
I'm going to come in just because we're running quickly out of time. I wanted to give Hamid the final comment, if you allow me. Hamid, just as a final comment, then on this issue of, again, of Islamo-leftism, as the education minister has spoken about in universities, what are your thoughts about, academic freedoms then within the country and, the witch hunt? Will France now, do you think, now censor voices within academia?
Of course, censor voices is very critical, and for the image of France. France, as you know, is the human rights country, is famous for that. Is the country of human rights. And I think the French government, and Emmanuel Macron particularly, doesn't accept criticism thinking, particularly with the academics thinkers. Of course, this open letter gave a warning to the French president, but also the international community now is focusing on the presidency, the French presidency, and Emmanuel Macron, he's elected himself. But I think that will be a first step, and they will have another step. Of course, they will have, of course, protests. People are going to protest, obviously, this week, and to denounce these brutal measures against the freedom of speech, the freedom of liberty, and the freedom of thought. I think President Macron has an agenda, obviously, and everything that is for the next election in 2022, as he's mentioned your guest, Abdennour Toumi, President Macron has only one agenda, one road, is to run for the next election and to be elected. That is his that is the main key. And he will, of course, not be elected, obviously, and his first challenger will be Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the leftist, and Marine Le Pen, the right party. But today, the journalists and the civil society in France are condemning with the strong voices the French president, and this is, I think, it will be a dangerous step for the French president. So he has to really stop.
Indeed. We'll have as a final comment. We do sincerely appreciate both Abdennour and Hamid for their time and, of course, for sharing their expert thoughts with us on this issue of, two issues that we've spoken about, academic and press freedom. Okay, in one side, the French are saying that, or the French parliament at least is discussing and debating now a bill about limiting images of police that can be used even in cases of police brutality so that they're not used maliciously, quote unquote, according to that bill. And then, of course, there's the issue of academic freedom. Will France now go into universities and actually censor voices that it does not like, that it feels or go against the values, quote unquote, of the Republic? What does that even mean? Aren't one of the values of the Republic to actually have an uncensored conversation at any respective issue? This seems to defy logic altogether. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. And on this final segment of today's show, we're going to discuss more Pakistani politics, but we're going to discuss this issue because it has become internationalized. A member of the National Assembly of Pakistan on the opposition side, by the name of Ayaz Sadiq, has made a statement not too long ago about what happened last year in 2019 and the Pakistan-India tensions that occurred last year, which originated, of course, from the Indian incursion into the Pakistani side, as well as the dropping of a payload. And we all know that Pakistan then, of course, retaliated in kind, as it was its right to do. I remember covering that issue live here on Indus News as well. Nevertheless, Mr. Sadiq came out and made a number of statements which have been perceived by everybody, really, and critics, experts alike, that were anti-state in some fashion, anti-army as well, saying that essentially in some way Pakistan was actually the one defeated, even though it was the country that actually handed back the Indian pilot that it captured as a goodwill gesture, and something that, of course, Prime Minister Khan at the time had said and warned, really, that tensions should not rise further at that point because, again, both countries are nuclear-armed countries and, of course, for a whole host of other regions, for regional peace, etc. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. And I'm joined by retired Lieutenant General Ghulam Mustafa, who's joining us from right here in Lahore. He is a defense analyst. And General Mustafa, thank you very much for your time and for joining us here in Scope. How do you react to Mr. Sadiq's statements?
There are a number of things that I think we need to look into. Number one, this is not a one-off statement. Two, it's not point scoring simply. And three, what he said about the blatant lie, frankly, because I understand and I know quite a bit of what happened that night and night prior to that. So therefore, I know there's a blatant lie. Lying on the floor of the assembly has now become a hallmark of this party, Pakistan Muslim League Nun Group, because if you recall last time, one of their prime ministers, who has now been declared an absconder, he also lied on the floor of the assembly, using floor of the assembly to lie and put your point across. I think is probably one of the very worst things that one can imagine in Pakistan politics. Number two, in this regard, that we need to understand that what happened that night was different. What happened thereafter was totally different. What Pakistan had done and what the world reported, that to obviate any chances of India taking further strikes into Pakistan, Pakistan had put itself in a position where it could have retaliated and could have hurt India very badly. That is when the world community got active and they forced India, and of course they talked to Pakistan also. So factuals is something different. What he said was totally different. And in this regard, the third important thing is that this was a prepared statement. This was not us, or one of the cuff, simply somebody standing up in the assembly and saying whatever comes through his mouth. And coming from the Speaker of the National Assembly, who has come well prepared, and this links into whatever Nawaz Sharif has been yapping about from across the seven seas from UK. It dovetails into that, and he is actually trying to tell the people of Pakistan that number one, your armed forces are lying to you. Number two, the government is lying to you. And number three, that Pakistan actually is not good enough, not fit enough to face any kind of trial. Should it be a simple skirmish on the borders or beyond that? So that kind of impact that he's trying to create, this actually, besides supporting what Nawaz Sharif has been saying, this also dovetails into what the Indians have been saying.
Right.
So when you look at the whole thing in this perspective that I said, one realizes that Ayaz Sadiq, who I thought was a very reasonable man, as the Speaker of the National Assembly, and then one thinks back. I mean, this guy had let one very controversial bill pass through, didn't react to it. It was only one after somebody in the Senate pointed it out. Right. He came on the floor and lied again, that this was a clerical error. So when you look at this, we find that our very, very responsible people, so-called, have not only lied to us openly, not only done something that dovetails into Indian or enemies' propaganda, but three, they are trying to create divisions within.
So, General Mustafa, if I may come in on that point, because, you know, when we're talking about the goal here, right, this has, as I said in my introduction, become an international issue because even at that time, as you well said, other countries, regional countries as well as global countries, were concerned about the tensions at the time, saying that, you know, that should not become worse, and spoke to both sides also, as you correctly pointed out. So then what exactly is the goal through such statements for the international community's part? I mean, of course, on the Indian side, it's quite obvious how they would use such a statement. But even beyond that, what exactly is Mr. Sadiq's goal when it comes to the world? What is he trying to send a message about to the rest of the world about Pakistan? What are your thoughts on that?
I think the underlying message that Ayaz Sadiq sent across was very, very dangerous. It's telling the world that do not trust anywhere in Pakistan. Do not trust Pakistan. Do not go in with the state of Pakistan. I mean, if the international community perceives the whole thing as Ayaz Sadiq had said, that means that Pakistan armed forces, Pakistan's government, Pakistan's media, and whatever was going wrong, being put across on the TV, was all a facade. Actually, the reality is that Pakistan is unfit to do anything by itself. So if this kind of an impact he's trying to create, that kind of an impact, and again I'll come back to it, that is actually building up on that narrative which Nawaz Sharif started from London. So look at it from this viewpoint, and this puts Pakistan as a state into a very, very unenviable position to the world community. If ever somebody takes it up as a truth, that would mean that Pakistan as a whole has been lying. not only to its own people, but to the world as well. So why would world trust Pakistan or any other thing? And of course, threat of the sword that is standing on Pakistan, there is a sword of Damocles. That again, I mean, it's horrifying when you look at it.
As just a thought, General Mustafa, before I let you go in just under a minute, if you can, certainly it would be, even on a very objective point of view, it would be very hard to fake something like this, right? I mean, Pakistan, what it did at the time was applauded by the rest of the international community because it handed back this Indian pilot, again, a goodwill gesture, which it was not required to do, but nevertheless, it did it.
I mean, the world saw the whole thing happening. And in this day and age, when Pakistan and India, because of the tension which had been built up, immediately after it was announced that Indian aircraft had crossed into Pakistan airspace, the whole world was focused onto the two states. They were looking at what is happening, and they were getting minute-to-minute information. And therefore, the world knows it differently, luckily, because that is what actually happened. So the world also, I mean, Pakistan never reported this. The world reported that Pakistan, when it was learned that India is trying to put in the BrahMos missiles in Rajasthan and trying to strike 6 targets in Pakistan. And retaliation, not a retaliation, but as a precaution, according to reports that I received from the world media, world press, that Pakistan had moved its longest shooting missiles, which are capable of carrying nuclear warheads, and which could strike Andaman and anywhere else strike India anywhere. I mean, that is when the world realized that how serious Pakistan is, that Pakistan can and will go to the extent that is required to safeguard its sovereignty. Indeed. So that is when the world interceded. Had Pakistan not been serious, the world wouldn't have interceded. They would have allowed Indians to carry forward whatever they wanted to.
Indeed. There was a final word, General Mustafa, but we do sincerely appreciate you taking your time out to speak to us here in Scope today. That was Lieutenant General Ghulam Mustafa speaking to us today from Lahore. Speaking about, of course, the statement of this MNA, this member of the National Assembly, his statement being perceived, of course, by critics as well as experts and officials as anti-state, anti-army, regarding what happened last year vis-a-vis the tensions between Pakistan and India, as well as the Indian incursion over the border into Pakistan, the dropping of a payload, then Pakistan retaliating at that time, capturing an Indian pilot as well, who, of course, had crossed over into Pakistani territory. Also, nevertheless, handing him back to his country as a goodwill gesture, seemingly throwing a shadow upon all of that, even though, as General Mustafa correctly said, the rest of the world was the one, in fact, that reported on what actually happened in the country, considering, of course, the world was quite legitimately worried about the tensions at that time between these two nuclear-armed neighbors. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.